Hello friends, this is Growl. In this video, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know to play Druid in 9.1 Mythic Plus. This video is going to be basic and mostly just go over my choices and why I do what I do, but I also hope to cover all the stuff that I've learned playing Druid so far in Shadowlands, so I hope this will be helpful not just for people who are beginning as Druid and learning what to do to set up, but also people who are returning to the spec, the new patch, trying to figure out what's going on. Druid's definitely fallen a little bit from grace since its dominance throughout all of BFA, but I still think it's a really good healer. The main thing holding it back, I think, from the highest keys is just doing less damage than some of the other options. When it comes to like its healing and its utility, it's really strong and even the best when it comes to utility stuff and doing sustained healing without cooldowns. One thing I want to mention before I start is that I make tons of videos and I also stream high keys for many different healers. So don't forget to subscribe to my channel and go follow my Twitch. Links for that stuff as well as like all my weak auras and UI and stuff you'll find in the description of the video. Let's get started. So now let's talk about what's changing in 9.1 for Druid. Yeah, not much. Druid didn't really see too much changes. I know a lot of people are let down a little bit. We've seen less Druids in the meta than before, but I think overall it's still not too bad for Druid. With the nerfs to Pally, the new seasonal affix I think will be nice for Druid stats increasing. So don't sweat too much about the lack of changes. I think Druid's mostly fine. Could maybe use a little bit of help in raid, but that's it really. For race selection, it doesn't really matter too much. I would say Troll for Horde, Night Elf for Alliance, but honestly, just play whatever you want. It doesn't matter for race. For stat prio, ideally, haste is our go-to. We want to get haste items and then prioritize item level. Eventually, you may reach a point where you feel like your haste is too much, where you're running out of mana or something like that. I haven't hit that point. I'm at 28% right now. My gear isn't great. You know, it'll definitely go up as you go. This also may change preference as well. You know, you may like a ton of haste. You may feel like you run out of mana and want lower haste. Once you feel like you have enough haste, then you kind of want to just go towards other stats. When you're just starting off, you can just go high item level. Don't worry about what the secondaries are. As you start gearing up, though, and you start getting more comfortable, you kind of want to aim for damage. You don't want to have mastery because it doesn't help your damage, so ideally we like crit and verse. I prefer crit slightly over verse, however, it's, you know, you kind of want to mix of both, and verse is good for survivability too. For trinkets, by far the go-to. The first one is Changeling. Changeling is just a great stat stick. Good uptime, gives you some haste. As your second trinket, you have a lot of options. I would say you may see people running like Ruby from Theater of Pain and using it with your Convoke. Spoiler, we're going to be playing Night Fate probably. Using Ruby with Convoke just to do extra bonus damage and bonus crit. Another option is maybe some of the stuff from the raid. There's some okay raid trinkets here. Titanic Ocular Gland is going to be a nice stat stick as well. The Ivory Keepsake I think could be okay for healing. The Bell from Tazavesh could be an okay trinket too, if you can get it from hard mode or whatever. Shadowed Orb kind of seems like a fun trinket as well. I know I talked about avoiding mastery, but this, you know, this could be a fun trinket to use for sustained healing as well. For enchantments, I think I would just stick to standard stuff. We got 30 stats on chest, 15 int on bracers. For cape, 20 stamina and avoidance or leech. Don't think it matters too much. And then again, we're gemming haste. We're gemming and enchanting haste on all of our stuff. You can also put fall damage reduction on boots, which can be useful sometimes. Not as useful for Druid. For consumables, we want our Spectral Flask of Power. Lasts a long time, as well as Shadow Core Oil. I'm usually using these in most keys just because they're reasonably cost efficient. Also, don't forget Desolate Armor Kit, gives you a little bit of stamina. For food buff, I use Crown Roast just for the haste. Ideally, you'd like to use a Feast, but Feasts are expensive, and who buys those? So we'll probably just stick to Crown Roast. And if you really want to try hard, you can use Augment Runes. These are very expensive for how little stats they give, but, you know, if you want them, you want them. We'll talk about Legendaries to craft. I've been a little slacking on my Druid Legendaries, so I don't have everything. We'll have to open up the Dungeon Journal. I think the go-to first craft for most Druids is probably going to be Verdant Infusion. Verdant Infusion, really versatile legendary, good for arenas, good for Mythic Plus, good for raid, and it will extend hots when you use Swiftmend, as well as not consume a hot. It's going to make your Swiftmend feel good. It's going to have you cast Swiftmend more often and get more value out of it. Overall, it's just a great healing Lego, especially now that Pride has kind of gone away and it's a bigger shift towards single target healing. Verdant's going to feel even better. After you have your Verdant Infusion, if you're looking for a more damage-oriented option, your two go-tos are Circle of Life and Death and Draft of Deep Focus. I would say Circle is probably better for overall damage. It's mainly used for speeding up your Sunfire, because Sunfire does so much of your damage, you know, the bigger the pull you get. However, for single target, I think Draft is going to be better. I'm not sure which one, you know, people are going to use. I think we're seeing people experiment with both, and we'll just sort of see how they go. But this is more of like a later season trying to min-max DPS sort of thing. I know there's a lot of other options that look fun. You know, there's the Night Fae Lego. There's the Heart of the Wild Lego. Personally, I think they're just not great. If you want to try them, you know, go ahead. But I think the go-to is going to be Verdant and then a DPS Lego. Dark Titan's Lesson, I didn't really like this. Mother Tree is good for AoE healing, but once Verdant Infusion got buffed and now that Pride's away, I think Verdant is going to be your go-to healing Lego. Let's talk about Covenant. So I mentioned Night Fae in the video earlier. I think mainly we're going to be playing Night Fae. Convoke is just a really strong button. Night Fae also has a great Soulbind tree. I think you can play Necrolord as well. Honestly, you can play any Covenant, right? I don't want to make it seem like you have to play Night Fae. We've been seeing some good Druids like J.B playing Necrolord, and maybe they can make it work. We're not really sure. But I think healing wise, especially if you're, you know, just setting up Resto Druid, you're gonna have a better time with Night Fae. I think also Night Fae is better for other specs of Druid as well. The Soulbind tree that I like personally for general use is Dreamweaver. Dreamweaver has some really good passives that you don't have to give up potency conduits for. The first one is Fuel the Blossoms. This gives you a little thingy on your feet, this little blue circle, and it just gives you haste when you stand in it. Haste, you know, again, super good stat, lasts for a long time, you know, during Bloodlust or whenever you use Convoke, which is nice. Another highly underrated passive is Pod Tender. This, a lot of people might think this is weird, but a cheat death in Mythic Plus every 10 minutes is insanely valuable, especially in Pugs. Just being able to stand in a stupid swirly because you were tunneling on health bars and getting resurrected is fine. My main critique that people say about this is that it's, oh, you can't get rezzed when you're in it, but let's be honest, if you're pugging keys, and even higher up people are monkeys and they're not even paying attention to you dying. So like, when is the last time you've died and then been resurrected like within 5 or 6 seconds? Like almost never. So it almost always feels good to have Pod Tender. I can't think of a single situation where I'm like, oh no, I had Pod Tender, this is bad for me. Another option for Soulbinds, if you're looking for a more DPS oriented option, is Karain. Karain has two important passives, First Strike and Wild Hunt Tactics. These are not very useful for healing at all, however, they're really, really good for damage. In combination with Convoke, if you get that First Strike buff and you're hitting a target with high health for Wild Hunt, you're doing a ton of damage on your Convoke. So if you're looking to really min-max your damage, and I think maybe we'll see Druids and High Keys doing this, I think Karain's the move. But for general use, for doing more healing, I think I would stick with Dreamweaver. This row is all three of these are pretty competitive, by the way. I think now that you get 3 potencies, I would actually probably take one of these other 2 rows. I'm not sure what the move is, but I would take, because our third potency is not very strong with Dreamweaver, I would take one of these rows. For our 2 potencies, I would use Conflux and Unstoppable Growth. Unstoppable is our best HPS potency, and anytime we need to do AoE healing, we're using that regrowth. And Conflux is also a good HPS if we need to use Convoke for healing, and it's also insanely good for damage as well. By far one of our best damage conduits. For the third potency, if you insist on taking a 3 potency row, I don't really know. All these other ones are less good. You can pick any of them if you prefer, you know, the Swiftmend healing one. Flash of Clarity, I think, is the highest HPS, but, you know, does that really matter? For endurance conduits, I really like Well-Honed Instincts. The automatic Frenzied Regen proc is really good. Remember, even though it says Guardian spec, this works in human form. So it'll work all the time as Resto Druid. This procs, it's amazing. As a second option, I kind of like Urson Vigor. It gives you health when you shift into bear form, and a lot of times when you're about to take big damage, you can switch into bear form, and so these first 4 seconds are going to be really valuable, and that's going to help prevent you from, you know, random one shots, or just like in an emergency. If you know you're about to take massive lethal damage, you can do this. You can press Barkskin, and you're going to be really tanky. Actually, it's going to take a lot of damage to kill you. You'll be able to live through almost everything with that trait. For finesse, I don't think it matters too much. Usually I take Born of the Wilds just because it reduces Heart of the Wild, and you can try and sneak it in with every other Convoke, but all these other ones are good too. The Stampeding Roar and the Born Anew for the food buff. Let's talk about talents. I actually get a lot of questions about talents for Druid. I do maybe some different stuff from other people, so keep in mind that you can run whatever you want, guys. You can switch talents whenever you want for each dungeon. Don't think that anything that I say is law, or that anything anyone else does is law. So for the first row, I think Cenarian Word's the best option. You can take Abundance sometimes, but generally speaking, don't take Nourish, don't take Abundance, just go Sen Word. Second row, I think Wild Charge is just the go-to. I know some Druids like Renewal, but in my opinion, you don't really feel as a liability as Druid. As a Resto Druid, you're very tanky. You can also stay way in the back. I just feel like I don't really use Renewal that much. Wild Charge helps me get out of danger quickly and saves me from one-shots, which, you know, as you move up in Mythic Plus, happens more and more. Also, it's just so much more fun to use. Feral versus Balance. This is one that gets asked so much, and people are so strongly opinionated. In my opinion, they're very similar. The biggest differences are that I find Feral Affinity more fun. It's also better if you need to move a lot. When you're running Balance Affinity, you have to hard cast a bunch of spells, and if there's a lot of movement, it feels bad. You know, especially thinking a week like Sanguine, or I guess Sanguine a little bit, but I was mainly thinking like Quaking or Volcanic or something like that. It feels bad to be Balance Affinity. However, the pros of Balance Affinity are, number one, your Convokes are stronger. You do more single target and AoE damage with your Convokes. So if you're doing like a DPS build with a unused Trinket and you're running Karain, and you're trying to do big Convoke damage, you're going to see better results for sure with running Balance Affinity. On top of that, Balance Affinity also has Typhoon. Typhoon is a very good utility, especially on a week like Sanguine. You know, even if you're normally a Feral Affinity player, you may want to consider running Balance Affinity for like a Sanguine week, just to help, you know, reduce the healing. Another thing is Balance Affinity, you can stay at range all the time. You don't have to worry about being in melee. This might be appealing to some people, but again, this is totally preference. Don't sweat whatever choice you make. Fourth row, I generally take Heart of the Wild because it's the only option that gives you damage. However, if you in a dungeon, if you feel like you can get use out of Mass Roots or Bash, you can do either of these. Mass Roots I'll run sometimes during Spiteful if I feel like my team decides to get hit by Spiteful a lot. But otherwise, I run Heart of the Wild. This row, I like Soul of the Forest, almost always. I think Incarn is a trap. It sounds like it's good because it's a big cooldown every 3 minutes, but it's not nearly as big as you think. It essentially just increases your healing by 15%. That's almost all it does, because all the other enhancements aren't very good. Being able to instant cast regrowth can be kind of nice, I guess, but Druid's already a really good healer on the move anyway. So although Tree of Life is great in Raid because it gives you more mana efficiency and, you know, acts as a really big cooldown that you can pair with like Flourish or something, in Mythic Plus, it's less of a big cooldown. It's not something really strong like Apoth or Ascendance or something like that from another healer. It's somewhat weak, actually. This row, always taking Spring Blossoms. This puts a hot on your Efflo, which increases your mastery healing. We don't run with a lot of mastery, but it's still nice compared to the other two options. And in the last row, I've been seeing a lot of people take Flourish. I think in Season 2, I'd generally recommend Photo. Now that we don't need the AoE healing from Pride, and also just having more sustained tank healing is really good too. The thing about Photo is that it's just good all around. Like it's working all the time. It can be good for AoE healing or single target healing. It's not a talent that you have to use specifically or play around. I think that if you're struggling with certain burst AoE healing, you can take Flourish, and nothing wrong with Flourish. Germ, I would not recommend. So I get asked a lot with Photo, how do you use it? It's pretty simple. If there's one person that you need to heal, you put Life Bloom on that person. That's it. If there's more than one person you need to heal, like group damage, then you put Life Bloom on yourself. That's it. So no hard rule of thumb, you know, no, oh, always have Life Bloom on X, you know, just heal one person, Life Bloom on that person. Heal lots of persons, Life Bloom yourself. So on that topic, let's talk about rotation. So I like to think of Druids healing as sort of like, I don't know, like layers, if you will. It's really important that you're constantly keeping some hots up all the time. So the 3 hots that you want to always maintain are Efflow, Life Bloom, and Cenarian Ward on cooldown. These are very, very efficient buttons. They're going to do a lot of healing just on their own. You know, this may contribute 30 to 40% of your overall healing, just those 3 buttons, maintaining them all the time. Then, if that isn't quite enough, then we need to start applying some light healing on people. My first instinct is usually to rejuve them. This puts a hot on them, so I can get additional mastery healing as well as use a swift mend if I need to, and it'll just, you know, heal them. Another thing you can do is if someone's low and you have a rejuve on them but it's running out, you can just use the swift mend. Same if you have a regrowth or a wild growth on them. Don't be afraid to just pop a swift mend. Swift mend's a really, really short cooldown. It lasts, you know, it's only 15 seconds, so don't think of swift mend as like a big emergency heal. You're just pressing it as much as you can to top people. So if, you know, I think of swift mend as almost like a first responder healer. Like if someone drops to 60% and you need to give them a quick heal, if they have a hot on them, just throw out that swift mend. Then if you need to do sustained healing, that isn't quite enough. Your options are regrowth and wild growth. So regrowth on single target, wild growth on AoE. Can use both as well if you really want to stack up a bunch of hots. Generally speaking, you want to be careful about these abilities because number 1, you have to hard cast them. Number 2, they cost a little bit more mana. They're less mana efficient. And number 3, they just don't really do as much healing as you think they do. You know, you don't want to be in the habit of like, no, okay, you don't have any hots up and then, oh no, someone takes damage, now regrowth. You know, that's not what you want to do. You want to have Efflow, Life Bloom, Send Ward already, and then someone's taking damage. Okay, now we throw out the rejuve. Maybe we'll use Swift Mend to get a little bit of healing to get that low regrowth off, and then, okay, now we have a juiced up wild growth or a juiced up regrowth with our Soul of the Forest. If in the case of an emergency, like let's say someone dips very low and you think they're in danger and you want to cast a regrowth on them, that's what Nature Swiftness is for. I have this on a separate macro. I know some people like to macro this, but I found it most convenient to just have it on a button. You know, you're a Druid, you have 500 keybinds anyway, what's one more? Then you can pop that Nature Swiftness. One thing to know, if you didn't know, is that Nature Swiftness lets you cast regrowth in any form. So let's say you're in cat form, right? You're doing DPS. One of your DPS players steps on something and takes a little bit of damage. You don't want to shift forms to heal them because it may only cost 1 spell. You can actually use Nature Swiftness in cat form and then regrowth them and then just continue your weaving. And in Boomy form, you can actually just cast regrowth in Boomy form, but again, using Nature Swiftness is fine in that situation as well if you don't want to hard cast. Now for cooldowns, I think as you move up, as you get better and better, the goal is to use Convoke for damage more and more. That's because Convoke is a good damage button. You can press it and it does good damage. Not many healers have this ability where they can use a cooldown for healing, also for damage. So that's what makes Druid cool and fun, I would say. But as a beginner, don't be afraid to just slam Convoke to heal. There's nothing wrong with just using Convoke as a healing cooldown, but I would encourage you, as you're learning and playing, to actively be thinking about the situation and being like, okay, this pull's easy. I can, you know, let me just get into cat form or moonkin form and throw out a Convoke. Or, this next boss is really, really hard. Maybe I should just not Convoke and save it. Or, you know, level 3 is, oh, I'm going to Convoke this boss for damage because it's hard and I want it to die. Trank, however, Trank is a reasonable healing cooldown. It's slow, and it also requires you to be standing still, so be really careful when you start casting the Trank. It can be used as a little bit of an emergency button, because as soon as you press it, it just starts healing everyone and puts a hot out. Remember, don't be afraid to cancel the Trank. The stacking hot doesn't like stack mastery. If you have 5 stacks of the hot, it doesn't do 5 mastery stacks, it still only does 1. So don't worry about stacking up the hot or anything like that if you ever feel like you're in danger. And lastly, I want to talk about utility. Utility is what makes Druid shine. If you feel like, oh, I can't compete with Paladins, or I can't get invited because of Shamans or whatever, like, the main answer to that is using your utility well. There's going to be so much Druid utility. I'm not going to cover all of it in this video. You know, that's for you to explore. I would say the most important one, probably Ironbark. This is, you have the shortest external cooldown that you can use on a tank. It gives 20% DR and 20% increased healing from you. You want to use this early and often. Keep in mind that a 1.5 cooldown means that you can use it on basically every other pull, or use it once every single boss. So you should be using it every other pull and every single boss. Don't hold on to this for 6 minutes because, oh, we're fine. You know, just keep using this. Keep using it over and over again. Usually for tanks, there's 2 options. If a tank goes into a pull and they don't have any big cooldowns, I'll just use it on them right away, and I'll try and, you know, notice that as the tank's running in. Another option, if they go into a pull with cooldowns, is I'll wait till their cooldowns are about to run out, and then I'll slap that bark on them just to allow them to stay in longer, or give them a little bit of error. You know, if they, let's say they overstep their bounds a little bit and sit in the pack with no good defensives, I'll have that bark on them to at least help reduce the damage. Other than that, you have lots of good ways to help tanks as well. Ursul's Vortex slows mobs and pulls them in. You know, in that situation where your tank is starting to run low, they need to run away, you can throw down this Vortex and keep the mobs grouped. A lot of times tank is going to be worried. They want all the mobs to be together for the AoE. They don't want to run around and spread out all the mobs. So a Vortex on all the mobs kind of lets the tanks know, you know, okay, this, you know, this is good. You don't have to stand in here. I'll hold it together for now. Also with Boomy, you know, you can Typhoon right before Vortex too. Let's say the mobs are all over the place. Come over here, throw out a Typhoon, get them all gathered, then drop the Vortex. Really, really strong. Again, there's so much utility. I'm not going to go over everything, but constantly remember all your utility and watch top Druids, see how they're using their utility. Watch yourself back, see how maybe you could have used some of your utility better in situations. You know, there's so much. You have Soothe, you have Maim, you can stun in cat form. Stampeding Roar is really nice. You can use it to go from place to place. You can also just use it to give a speed buff to your ally if you know they need to go from point A to point B and they might be in danger. You know, if they're gonna die to a big swirly or whatever. Entangling Roots and Hibernate are both ways to CC mobs. Entangling Roots is great for patrols. I know all you guys have been in this situation when you're in a dungeon, you know, your team's monkeys, and a patrol's coming, and you see it coming in slow motion, you're running away from a patrol, but there's always that one hunter that's standing over here with his pet bird or whatever that pulls the patrol, and you're like, God, every time. But with Druid, you can walk over here, you can use Entangling Roots on the patrol, usually the frontmost mob or the leader, it'll stop it, and then that way this hunter will not pull it. Let's be honest, he's probably still going to pull it, but we can pretend he won't. That wraps up mostly everything I wanted to talk about. Obviously, there's a lot more depth to Druid. It's a pretty interesting and fun class, so this isn't everything, but it's most of the beginner stuff. I hope to do some more advanced stuff later. If you guys have any questions about Druid setup or anything super important that you think I missed, feel free to leave it down in the comments. I hope this video was helpful for you. Thanks for watching, and if you're looking for more content, don't forget to like and subscribe. Happy keying, friends.